like the destination or the goal that we want to reach. So in this small conference, I'll try to see what are the pathways, are the ways, the strategies, the approaches that we could take to go from where we are now to this communalist or big utopian future where we could build a society beyond the centralizing power of the state and capitalism. And in order to do so, another assumption I have is that there is no one unique way to go from where we are now to this communalist future. There are maybe 2, 3, or maybe more ways to go from where we are now to this post-capitalist and post-state future. So I'll try to explain in a few minutes. I don't have much time. The 2 or 3 ways that we could use to go from here we are now to this post-statist society. So the first thing I would say is that there's this autonomous democratic regions or zones strategy. So this kind of first strategy is the most, I would say, revolutionary or radical in its means in the municipalist movement. Its goal is to build self-governing local communities who actively challenge the state power and try to create entirely autonomous zones protected against the police and the military forces of the state. So the two most well-known autonomous democratic experience happening right now in the world are the Zapatistas movement in Chiapas, inside the Mexico state, and the Kurdish revolution movement in Rojava and other parts of this kind of Middle East region. So I won't be able here to explain the history and all the details of these experiences that I'm sure you already know a little bit about, but I would say first that these 2 experiences are the current lights of the communalist revolution in a strong term. And it includes at the same time a real concrete vision of all the obstacles, the challenges of this type of radical regional communalist revolutions that they face. So we don't have, I think that we must not have an idealistic view of this kind of experience because they face kind of complexities, contradictions, and we can try to learn from this kind of experience to see how can we try to form these other types of experiences, maybe in other countries or cities in North America, Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and several parts of the world. And I would say, let's say what is, in my view, the most interesting part of this kind of strategy and its principal weaknesses. So I would say the first part that is the most interesting thing with this strategy is that they are trying actually, and they're achieving this kind of building this economic self-sufficiency at this local level. They have their own armed citizens that can protect the local communities against the state power, the military forces of the state, and they are actually experimenting a form of communal life in a strong local autonomy way. So they are building not only actually existing municipalism as we see in several cities in Spain or in North America, but they are trying to build an actual existing communalism in real life with its new prefigurative politics, economics, and social forms of organizations. So I think that's the main achievement of these 2 experiments right now. They are doing it. They are experimenting it, they are self-learning about their own experiences, and they are actually achieving this kind of revolution at the regional and not only the local or municipal level. So I think that's the first big achievement. But at the same time, the main weakness of this time of radical autonomous strategy is that they remain really vulnerable, they remain weak a little bit and fragile against the state powers surrounding them. So they need a kind of transnational solidarity movement, but at the same time, it's really difficult to build an actual existing communal economic and political life while there are like forces and armies and different kind of geopolitical strategies and wars around them. So I think it's a really difficult situation, and that's a really difficult pathway to go towards communalism. So that's the first thing. Another thing is that it also needs a kind of strong commitment for ordinary people, citizens, to risk their life for this kind of freedom and to try to go beyond the state and try to build well beyond capitalism in their own way. It's really difficult. And I'm not really sure that every part of the world is actually ready to go this kind of revolution in every part. So I think there are maybe some pieces and other regions and kind of interstitial parts of the world where we could experiment this kind of revolutions. But it's really like a radical thing to do that mostly maybe it could happen in several parts of the world where the state power is weak, where the oppressed peoples, groups, and nations are willing to overthrow the state power by building self-governing communities. So I think that's an interesting part, but it's really difficult to achieve this kind of experiments across all the cities of the world in the world we are now in 2021. So that's the first thing. The other strategy that I would like to put forward is the constituent process. So it means, let's say, there could be a window of opportunity to rewrite the constitutions of several countries. And inside this constituent process, maybe the municipalist movements could try to put forward the idea to replace the traditional nation-state model by a confederal, decentralized social or plurinational republic. And recent historical examples of constituent processes took off in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Iceland, and now we're seeing one big happening right now in Chile. And I think if the municipalist movements were really strong, they could see, okay, let's not just try to write a new constitution and to just make some small changes and superficial things inside the nation state. We're trying to replace the nation state with a kind of new kind of republic, a communalist, kind of decentralized, with self-governing communities that could actually go beyond the nation state, as it were, like in the capitalist, modern, patriarchal, colonial state that we inherited in the modern society that we're now. So I think that could be an opportunity. And in Turkey, where the Kurdish movement is pretty strong, but really repressed by Erdogan, there was this HDP party that was claiming that we could try to rewrite the constitution. So to start a constituent process to rewrite the constitution of Turkey in order to build kind of decentralized political system where self-governing political communities at the local level could articulate themselves in a confederated way. So I think this kind of constituent process could happen in several parts of the world where maybe there are some kind of independentist movements, like in Catalonia or across Spain, if Podemos would seize the state power and say, we'll try a big constituent process all across Spain to try to decentralize and to make a kind of big communalist, democratic, decentralized community. That could be a thing that could exist. Here in Quebec, where I live now, in Canada, there's this independence, this movement. It's not really cool right now. It's pretty more like a right-wing nationalist movement, but there's a left-wing independentist movement that could try to build, let's say, if we try to unbuild what's happening now and to build a new thing, instead of creating a new nation state in a small scale, we could try to make a new kind of political system altogether. And across Canada, there's this indigenous resurgence movement happening right now at different places. So maybe not only in Quebec, but across all Canada, which is a big country with several regions, maybe that's maybe utopian. We could build a constituent process to try to rebuild and go beyond the nation state of Canada to build a confederation of free nations with the indigenous people having their own local self-governing communities. The Quebec could have his own, British Columbia, New Brunswick, several parts of the world, trying to build a new political system altogether. So that's an opportunity. And I think the main risk with this view of this movement, let's say, would try to seize the state power and to bring a constituent process and to change the state altogether. The main risk would be that the movement actually and the society decides just to go from one nation state to another, just like they're just rewrite the constitution and they remain with the fundamental structures of the modern capitalist colonial state. So that's a big challenge, I would say. And this kind of outcome is really a thing that could happen, especially if the municipalist movement in a country is pretty weak and has not put the ideas of a confederation in the political imagination of the people of the nations. So that's really important, like to start from where we're now to bring this new kind of confederation imagination inside like the different parts of the world. And I would finish my small talk here, my presentation, to say there are two different ways. And I think we could try to combine those to kind of bring a hybrid strategy, maybe to try to build actually existing local communities that are autonomous from the state, but at the same time trying to articulate this, combine this with another strategy at an other scale that would say we should at the same time trying to rebuild the state and go beyond the state to build a confederation of the people, of the cities. And maybe, but that's maybe complex and I don't have much clue how to implement this in real life. Let's say we could have like social movements, anarchist movements, social kind of experiments at several parts. At the same time, we could have officials, elected people at the municipal scale and other people at the regional and national scale that would be committed to this kind of national or plurinational constituent process in order to create a new confederal movement across the territories. So I think that maybe another like third way to explore. It doesn't actually exist now, but that will be another thing to do, I think. And to try to conclude what I have to say, maybe there are other ways that I didn't have in mind. Maybe my other comrades, colleagues here around the table, and you, like, or who will listen to this conference, have other ideas about what we should do. I think the important thing to do is not to only try to build more participatory democracy at the local level. We should do social reforms, and we need some radical reforms right now to answer and respond to urgent needs. But at the same time, we should not try to think that we will build municipalist or communalist future with small reforms here and then. We must have a big strategy to overthrow or go beyond the state. And we have to ask this question right now to see how the reforms that we do are not ends in themselves, but tools or means toward the big goal, which is a new kind of society, which would be beyond the state, capitalism, social hierarchies, and beyond the nation state as it exists now. So I would conclude with this and say we have to open our political imaginations, imaginaries, and try to invent new futures. And at the same time, in each part of the world, each region and countries, we should implement our own strategy to see how we can go from where we are now to this post-capitalist, post-statist world. So I would end now, and thank you for listening to me for a few seconds and minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That's a beautiful overview. That's a perfect way to kick off the conversation. And before, I just want to remind anybody who is tuning in a little late that please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We definitely want to make this a conversation, not just lectures. So, and I've put the names of everybody on the panel there. If you want to direct a question, just type it in and we'll get to those questions after. And now we can next hear from Pablo. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this very stimulating panel. Let me just give a very brief note of situation about who I am, or better, about who I am no longer. So I am no longer involved in the front line of politics. As you mentioned, I was involved for the let's say, populist uprising that happened in Europe from 2013 until 2019. Then I moved back to academia, but I am no longer, sadly, a New Yorker either. So I'm transitioning back to Europe. I'm just starting at the University of Milan in Italy. So this is to say my perspective is very centered both on kind of the institutional dimension of my experience of politics and also in the kind of like American European dimension. That's from where I am talking. So what I wanted to do today is to bring very brief notes of, in reflection of the relation between the city and the state in relation to the ongoing geopolitical crisis. So I hope this is a somewhat different perspective from what Jonathan brought, but I hope it will be somewhat complementary. Let me start by the anecdotal. The other day I saw a tweet that I found very funny that said that in 2020, every political conference in the world had the same title, which was basically a version of the end of something, right? Globalization, neoliberalism, austerity, you name it. Whereas in 2021, every political conference seems to have once again the same title, which is either the return of or the future of. I thought that this pun was, apart from being funny, it kind of captures a certain spirit of the day or of the time, and also a certain political disorientation, let's call it that way, in relation to this kind of unpredictable, unstable political environment that we are going through. So what I wanted to do is to bring three ideas, very briefly exposed, and hence general, they will be maybe a little too abstract, about how to face the democratic struggle in relation to the question of the city and the state in the context of this crisis. So the first idea is what I would call a spatial antinomy, or at least an emerging contradiction or an emerging tension between or regarding the scale of political action. I think this tension was exemplified right at the beginning of the pandemic, when the pandemic first hit, in the clash between two kind of contradictory impulses that, in our political analysis, a lot of people had. First, there was this kind of cosmopolitan instinct, so to speak. So a position that saw in the pandemic precisely the kind of problem that shows that reveals the fact of our interconnectedness, and hence the need to develop political spaces, political mechanisms, political tools that will allow us to find common solutions to the common problems that we have as humanity, right? The pandemic, like climate change, is one of those problems that pushes us to develop this kind of cosmopolitical dimension, hence beyond the states, in order to be able to face this common endeavor, this common challenge of protecting ourselves, protecting the planet, and so forth. And hence all the debates about, a constitution for the earth, a global Green New Deal, the democratization of the multilateral system and international relations, and so on. Now, this impulse or instinctive reaction was clearly opposed to another thing that clearly happened, which was this kind of neo-Hobbesian revival of the state, right? So the state seemed to come back to the picture under the classical kind of exceptional mode or emergency power. So we saw, quarantines, full-scale mobilization, the return of a spatial politics of the border, and so on. And it was as if, the Leviathan was coming back from a lethargy of decades, and this could not fail to provoke some kind of admiration or fascination, even if most of the time what we saw was kind of a display of political impotency and the lack of capacities to deal with this kind of problems. Now, I think that this contraposition, which by the way is the cleavage that the radical right is activating everywhere, when they speak of globalist versus the resurgency of nations, I think they are pointing in a brutal primary mode of expression to a real contradiction, to something real that is happening, which has to do with, and this is the second idea that I wanted to bring, a certain sort of spatial anxiety, to a malaise or a feeling of uneasiness regarding political action, that I think that is also related to a certain crisis of expectations, and a crisis, I think Jonathan's presentation was very much about that, of the political imagination, right? The roadmap, the goal. So this kind of spatial anxiety, I think that is a symptom, or at least is in relation to something quite important that is going on, which is basically a modification, an adaptation, a transformation of the spatial regime of globalization. I think that there are ongoing substantive transformations of the hegemonic logic, economic, political, spatial logic that has defined global governance, at least for the last 3 decades. Now, it is obviously not my intention to engage here in a debate about, the true nature of Bidenomics or, whatever comes after neoliberalism and so on, but simply to point towards a fact that is an acceleration of a process of what I would call a political reorientation of globalization, namely a process of reordering, of repositioning of political actors across the different levels of global governance in our contemporary system. Now, if the economic nature of the state, if the economic role of the state, for instance, changes, obviously this has implications at all levels of that very complex regime of jurisdictions, of limits and capacities that has defined the governance of neoliberal globalization so far. I think that the spatial anxiety that a lot of people feel in relation to how to act politically in a moment of crisis has to do with that transformation that is transmitting itself in that process of adjustment to all these levels, and hence creating a situation of indeterminacy, instability, and uncertainty. Now, third idea that I wanted to bring, and this might be perhaps maybe a little more polemical. I think that this process of transformation of global governance will have significant effects, as I was saying, on a specific discourse and also on a specific practice regarding the role and the political capacities of cities across the world. Now, under the hegemonic narrative of globalization, let's say that narrative of an ever deepening process of integration, of a smooth and open world space that was in the process of unification so that nothing would remain outside of it. Under that narrative, cities developed a kind of a specific political character, becoming sites of resistance against neoliberal globalization, becoming sites for the experience of autonomy, for horizontal integration, for the exploration of alternative modes of sociability, also for policy experimentation. But my feeling is that that character, that discourse built around the political potential of the city was in relation to the construction of that order of global governance. In a certain sense, it is as if cities had to fill in the spaces that states had abandoned because they relinquished many of their tools for socioeconomic intervention in reality, for instance, or had to invent, create, expand spaces always beyond jurisdictions, the jurisdiction of the state, the supranational, or in between, in the interstices of those jurisdictions. I think that the politics of municipalism was marked essentially by that relation to the development of this order that is now in crisis. This is to say that the present crisis of globalization, if my hypothesis, if the idea that I'm bringing hold, implies a struggle for resources, for capacities, for legitimacy, for power that will affect essentially the way in which we think of the cities, in which we think of the things cities can do. Now, I think that, at least from the perspective of democratic development from which I come from, that this process, this struggle, the direction of this struggle will depend essentially on one fundamental fact or one fundamental dimension, which is the redefinition, the renegotiation of the social contract that is happening, that will happen across the world. Why? Because I think that the present of politics is deeply defined by the exhaustion of an economic model under the conditions of ecological emergency, but also by the agony of social orders, the disruptions of which, have become too significant, too deep for things to go on as usual. So I think that the strategic question of our time, when we consider the political potentialities and the political capacities of cities and state, depends on a question today, which is what role will the city adopt, or can the city aspire to adopt in that process of the redefinition of the social contract, namely of the redefinition of citizenship, of redistribution, of ecological justice, of democratic communities. I think all those values, all those political relations are now the object of a historical struggle, namely the historical transition out of the mode of neoliberal governance of globalization. I will conclude by saying just this. If the populist uprising that happened mostly in Europe, here I'm talking from the European perspective, in the last decade or so, from the perspective of today, can be assumed to have had like one mission. If you ask me what was the mission of this cycle, I would say it was the repoliticization of sovereignty, the democratization of sovereignty. I think that was kind of the common thread of political platforms that tried to subvert a certain state of affairs in politics. I think that the challenge of today, the challenge that will define the political struggle of the present, is kind of a parallel operation based on the notion of citizenship, in this kind of broad sense in which, perhaps confronting the title of the panel, it is not so much a matter of opposing the city and the state at this particular junction, but of, imagining, developing and implementing democratic ways of articulation of cities and states that can expand the democratic potential of a constituent moment like this one, as Jonathan was saying, keeping in mind the extraordinarily powerful reactionary pressures and forces that this process will face. So on that kind of like sober note, I will leave it there and hopefully engage with all of you in the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Very much appreciated. And now we will go to 16.
Thanks a lot, Debbie, and thanks to the other speakers. So today I'll explore the fundamental principles, but also the problems and limits that surround the state and regional candidates from a communalist perspective. So as theorized by the American thinker Murray Bookchin, and accessorily Debbie's father too. So it's theoretical. It's not coming from my own experience with social movements and municipalist movements that I study also in France and in the US. So it's really kind of a theoretical exercise that I'm trying to do here. So I'll structure my talk in three parts. I'll first go over communalism to have like the framework in mind. So Jonathan already explained a lot, but I'll try to put some words to have it so we can explore the limits of regional and state candidacy on that basis. I'll then explore maybe some possibilities. We'll see that Bookchin is quite against it. I'll maybe explore possibilities and conditions that could nevertheless be open in a communist perspective for state and regional candidacies. And then finally, I'll explore the relationship communist movements that are using the road of the election would have with the states when they are confronted to the limits of the states and when they are choosing to actually disobey. So first, a quick recap of communalism. So it's, as Jonathan said, it's communalism calls for autonomous, directly democratic municipalities, which organized in confederations would be in direct competition for the claim to political legitimacy with the nation state. And the ultimate goal would be to abolish the nation state. And so Bookchin puts two things into question and rejects then two things. It's the political units at which a polity is organized, which is for the moment the nation state. He answers to it by the commune, and the way power is exercised, which is for the moment the model of representative democracy, and answers it by direct democracy. So communalism is a political philosophy according to which the municipality is the main political unit where communities directly manage their own affairs through popular assemblies that are functioning on the mode of face-to-face, which is very important, and direct democracy. And so I quote, it seeks to radically restructure cities' governing institution into popular democratic assemblies based on neighborhoods, towns, villages, and in these popular assemblies, citizens deal with community affairs on a face-to-face basis, making policy decision in a direct democracy. So this is a quote from Next Revolution that Debbie co-edited, which gathers texts of Bookchin around communalism and direct democracy. And so for issues that would exceed the scope of the municipality, and that's very important for the question at hand, communalism would propose a municipality that is organized in a confederated model, which is a network, again a quote, of administrative councils, whose members or delegates are elected from popular face-to-face democratic assemblies in various villages, towns, etc. And the members of the confederal councils are strictly mandated, recallable, and responsible to the assemblies that choose them for the purpose of coordinating and administering the policies formulated by the assembly themselves. So Bookchin then distinguishes between a function of policymaking, which is the political decision regarding the course of action of a municipality that should be taken by the popular assembly. And then on the other hand, administration of these decisions, which is the coordination and the execution of these decisions that would be carried out by delegates with recallable and imperative mandates under very close supervision of the popular assemblies. So of course, communalists are aware that the municipality is not sufficiently strong to challenge the state, whether that's economic, military, or political. So the strategy, as Jonathan said, the strategy of communalism is to create intentionally a situation of dual power between the confederation of communes based on local self-government and the traditional nation states, and the two would be competing for political legitimacy. So it would be basically to enlarge the municipality as a place where public freedom can be exercised and material needs can be met, up to a point that the state would be kind of hollowed out of its legitimacy. So the communist projects propose then two strategies to realize such a self-government of municipalities: the extra-institutional strategy, which is creating radically new and alternative institutions by building extra-legal popular assemblies to manage communal affairs independently of the political systems. So that could be for sure the example that Jonathan mentioned, Chiapas and Rojava, but that could also happen within our capitalist and statist system and not in secession of that state, but that could happen within. So the institutional strategy, which is what interests us here, is to occupy existing municipal institutions in order to radically transform them. That would consist in transferring the public power conferred by the election from the hand of the people, of the elected officials, into the ones of the popular assembly. And so in a nutshell, Bookchin proposes that communalist movement would run candidates for municipal elections who, as soon as they are elected, would use what, I quote again from Next Revolution, would use what real power their office conferred to legislate popular assemblies into existence. So really to make them have a legal existence and tie their office to the decision of these assemblies through the device of imperative and recallable mandates. And so in this way, elected officials would not be the ones entitled to make these decisions, but the role would be limited to organize popular assemblies, which would meet and deliberate and decide at the majority on public policies. And once a decision is reached, the assembly would define the content of the imperative mandate given to the elected official, whose action would be under very close supervision of the assembly, and whose sanction departure from from the mandate would be sanctioned by recall, or could be sanctioned by recall. This official would no longer be kind of a representative in the Burkean sense. So according to Edmund Burke, the representative are interests to use their agency and their reason to defend what they think is the preference and interest of their constituency. But in this conception of representation, of delegation, in the sense of Bookchin's communalism, we could consider representation as defined by Hannah Pitkin, so as defined generically, as the act of making present that which is absent. So basically, our current representative make present the disaggregated interests of the people through their own filter, and which is basically very different because elections follow an aristocratic logic. So their filter is very different than the one the population is actually living. And so this representative is unaccountable to them only at the time of their re-election. But I mean, since the choice is very limited, it remains unaccountable. And also they're submitted to structure that forces them, and that would force the most genuinely committed and benevolent Democrat and progressive candidate to actually yield to interest others that are the one she's supposed to represent. So instead, what communalism proposed would be that this representative would be a delegate, spokesperson, would be bound to try to legally ratify the decision as if it was her own. And when she has to submit her decision to the deliberation with others, because of course she's not alone to decide, unless she's mayor in some aspects, she would be entrusted to make present the already deliberated will of the assembly. So the will is made. It's not as now that when we think that the population thinks that and it's their interest, but the will is already formed and it's made into the imperative mandate. And then she would have to come back to her constituency with the result of this deliberation and to be empowered with the new mandate. And so it's the model that is in question here, and with this specific interrogation as to whether this model could be scaled up, as if we could possibly present candidates at the state or regional level. So Bookchin kind of answers to this question in Urbanization Without Cities. He considers that, and he says that in the force fields that exist between the Confederation of Municipalities and the nation state, either the municipalities and the Confederation will increase their power by diminishing the power of the nation state, or the nation state will increase its power by diminishing the authority of the municipalities and their confederation. And then he follows up and says, thus, for a municipalist movement to run candidates for state, provincial, or national office would be an absurd, in fact, oxymoronic subversion of its claim to seek a grassroots or participatory democracy, if only because any office beyond the municipal level is almost by definition a form of representation rather than participation. He continues, and that sentence is important, I'll come back to it. He says that even more significantly would ignore the crucial fact that as they run candidates for local offices, confederal municipalities are also running them against the state, provincial, and national offices and institutions. And so the demand for a municipal confederation is simultaneously a demand for opposition to the nation state in all its form, and to the illusion that a control of state, provincial, or national legislative bodies on the top is a precondition for the attainment of local power at the bottom. So it's very clear that Bookchin, insofar as the municipality should be conquered to be transformed as entities in opposition to the state, it couldn't be part of the same strategy to also consider conquer the state institutions, because the municipality is supposed to be in opposition to it. And it's also clear that it's the municipality that should be invested as a locus for dual power and not any other sides. But I want to spend some time on this sentence that I read you, because any office beyond the municipal level is almost by definition a form of representation rather than participation. So what's at stake here is that Bookchin presupposes that office beyond the municipal level entails representation. But the thing is that so do offices at the local level in our current system. So I think if we think representation in the sense I mentioned before as the making present of the already deliberated will of the assembly, this precise critique no longer holds, and we can avoid to just have elected people turning into progressive candidates independent from their constituents, because they would be entrusted with imperative and recallable mandates. But even if this critique does not hold, it doesn't mean that it's possible to elect state representative in a communalist perspective. So that leads me to my second point, which is to imagine possibilities of running candidates at the state level. So just to make it clear, we're talking about a situation in the case of dual power. So it's a strategy situation. It's not the situation of our ideal world that Jonathan was also picturing, which is we are there already, we have a community society. So it's different when we think about scaling up with a situation where assemblies already have the power and where the person would be simply a delegate at the confederal council. So we're now in the strategy situation. So maybe first let's start by why would we even consider having elected representative in a communalist perspective? So there could be possibilities of having alliances between communalist state representatives and local representatives in a communalist perspective to enable progressive policies, and mostly giving more power to the municipalities and therefore to the local assemblies, because they should be supposed to have the power through their elected people's mandate. Because without actual power, and I mean, we can have power at the local level, but as Debbie mentioned, also everything can be struck down by the state. So there's a fundamental tension here, and people would be soon discouraged. So there's an interest in trying to have elected people at the state level to try to enable a better framework for the municipal level to flourish. Then there's the argument that the state needs to be destroyed and that we need to empower it by giving directly democratic, and that we don't need to empower it by giving directly democratic candidates. That it's a level that has to be absolutely destructed, basically, and that filling in it with like candidates that would be linked with the mandate might not be the good solution. So I mean, that's a totally valid critique, but we could also say that we need to build a new confederation that is different from state structure for sure. But the municipality, I mean, the same argument would hold also for the municipality, because it also needs to be radically transformed. I mean, we wouldn't take the municipality as it is and we would transform it as well. So in a community society, maybe the confederal limits of a territory would follow the current state structure. And so we could also radically transform this state as well, this structure as well. And I'll continue by saying that if you have very, very strict conditions, basically that in all municipalities forming a constituency of a state or region, there already exist well-constructed and well-working assemblies that can hold in check their delegates and working with recall and imperative mandate. There's no reason why the confederal system of having delegates at the supra level with recallable and imperative mandates would not work on a theoretical level, but on a practical level, it's already, I mean, and that's maybe where my experience from fieldwork comes, it's already so hard to construct one assembly at the local level to already like hold their delegate in check and present delegates at the municipal elections, that having several functioning local assembly on a whole regional territory working at the same pace and being constructed in a similar way would be very hard. So there's no reason in theory why confederal system could not work on a strategic level, so presenting delegates at state and regional offices, but it's very hard in practice. And in the end, one problem remains is that even if we have very well constructed assemblies, how do we realize accountability? So how do we legally recall them? Or actually, how do we even in fact recall them? It's the same problem at the municipal level, but at the municipal level, we can just hope to have candidates that would change local bylaws to allow recall, which is way harder in state's constitution. So in my fieldwork, when I study a movement presenting candidates to give power to the assembly, that what they do is they sign a charter of the elected person, and which supposes to commit to respect the assembly's decision. But it's a moral and it's not a legal obligation. And recall is not possible in our legal framework. Because if it happens, it has to be because the assembly is very well functioning. And also if it happens, as I said, it's not legal, so it's becoming an illegal and disobedient act. And that leads me to my third part. So when it's try to relate the community strategy to the legal order. I try to propose another framework to understand how community strategy can relate to that. So as I said, the community strategy, whether it is at the local or if we imagine at the state elections, it would take time before leading to a community society with a new legal order for sure. And it's therefore relevant to think the relationship to the current legal order now. So by deciding to run for the municipal elections under the paradigm they are trying to escape, in order to change the municipal institutions according to the new paradigm, the new communist paradigm they are trying to create, communist movements present an ambiguous relationship to the law, because on the one hand, communist movements somehow recognize the legal order's legitimacy because they agree to play by the established rules to arrive in power. They acknowledge the very mechanism that is both symbolically and effectively at the origin of their discontent with the established political order, which is elections and the representation of the demos through election. And these movements are therefore not like at a complete cutoff point, because they use state-organized election to come into power, and they will likely cooperate with other levels of power, at least initially. And on the other hand, communist movements take this power with the ultimate goal of transforming the existing political, legal, economic, social order and changing the structures of power. So there's a tension here. And so the strategy they that they adopt supposes to assent to the legal legitimacy conferred by the election, at least initially, and use it to create popular assemblies, as Bookchin said, to legislate them into existence, to allow for the direct participation of unelected citizens through the assemblies. But by doing so, what we could call a communalist municipality would challenge the current form of exercise of power by making the assemblies the author of decision rather than the elected representative. And so thinking this peculiar relationship communalist movement have to the legal order requires to go beyond traditional framework. So since their political action would entail the violations of laws, I said, for example, the recall, that would entail a violation of the law. Or, for example, if they adopt a policy that would go against the state or the regional level, that could entail also violation of the law. We could maybe think of the classical concept of civil disobedience to capture the communalist movement representation to relationship to the law, sorry. But the concept of civil disobedience presents two limitations. So first, the civil disobedience pertains to the field of criminal law, which regulates the behavior of individuals, even though they might act collectively, but that's individually. And second, civil disobedience is still seen as a mode of action that presupposes the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the state, because they want, through their disobedient act, to contribute to a public debate on a given issue and provoke action of the state. And so that presupposes such a legitimacy of the state. And communalist movements do not attempt to remedy, to have recourse to civil disobedience to kind of trigger the sovereign to re-engage with a question. They want to create a new sovereign altogether. So the framework of civil disobedience might be or of little use to understand the communalist act of political creation, of creating a new polity. And so the concept of disobedience, though, could be still taken. And that's why I propose the concept of institutional disobedience, because that would cover the violations of the law of democracy, as it is posited now by our current bourgeois nation states. And because they would not respect the constitutional way of exercising power through what is classically called a republican form of government. Rather, they would condition the legitimacy of any act of self-government on the fact that the people directly participate and take that decision. And so our current everyday life is very much conditioned upon a certain understanding of our relationship to political power. So in so much as our behavior is conditioned by criminal law, it's also conditioned actually by public law and by laws of democracy. In the same way as citizens obey the logic of representative democracy and therefore do not participate directly in the political sphere, but retreat in their private sphere, communities who decide, thanks to the institution that they would transform, to manage their own affair could be considered to also disobey the law of democracy. And so thinking in terms of institutional disobedience could help to capture the communist activity. I'm going to finish on saying that, so if the political activity of a communist municipality was to be understood only in a fragmented way, maybe captured by civil disobedience, and in sporadic and unrelated action, this would completely miss the political dimension of the communist project, which is to change society, basically. And so it would obscure the coherent political strategy that aims at revolutionizing the political order by occupying and transforming municipal institutions. But since the term of disobedience, also since the term of disobedience presupposes a negative relationship to an existing order of things, I want to emphasize here that it should not be misleading as to the positive nature of the communist project, which is an act of political creation. It's the creation of a new order. And so contrary to other revolutionary movements in which the movement aims at the revolutionary change, which might appear more uncompromising toward existing structures of power, it's important to keep in mind that the communist movement's use of contemporary institution aims not only at putting an end to the life of the old society, but also at creating the foundations of a new one. And I'll finish here. Thank you for your attention. I hope I wasn't too long.
That was great, 16. Thank you so much for laying out that sort of theoretical foundation. I think it's going to be really wonderful now to hear from Biljana, who's been doing some real municipalist work, very, very strong municipalist work on the ground. So Biljana, will you take it from here?
Thank you, Debbie. Well, I'll try, but it's a bit, I come from the country where political setting is very unfavorable to many extents. So I'll try to just explain in what way I think about these issues, and maybe connect some of the issues that my previous speakers panelists have mentioned that caught my attention in relation to the story I'm about to say. So basically, I come from a political movement that has not won its city yet. So, you know, it doesn't mean that since we don't have this experience of winning the city and then having the state overcoming some of the decisions that we have made, it doesn't mean that there is no political repression even now when we act just as a political opposition. There is tons of it. But I would just frame my entire speech this evening as basically a struggle to create counterpower to win a city against what I call party state, because we in Serbia officially, as of a couple of years ago, no longer even represent representative democracy. You know, we are already labeled as a type of a hybrid regime, so competitive authoritarianism, which means that officially we have various parties and also abilities for citizen platforms like ours to participate in elections, but effectively it's almost impossible to win any elections. And as of last year, when the elections were organized in the midst of pandemic and basically in such a way that you know, information about the state of affairs with pandemics were hidden from citizens so that the elections could be organized. And many opposition parties, including our movement, decided to boycott these elections. Since these elections, practically there is no, only just a few municipalities throughout Serbia that are run by mayors or you know, coalitions that are not formed by a ruling party and their coalition partners. So basically all mayors in Serbia are members of one political party. And in such a state, you know, this is it's a very, very challenging situation. It's maybe I could compare it to a certain extent to what, to the state that will, you know, reach the level of situation in Turkey or maybe with Hungary. Also, that's the comparison for those who don't know the situation that I would make in terms of conditions. And this is very challenging for a municipalist movement as ours. On one hand, I would have to say that even though we are a local movement, the issues that we have been raising always had this just wider national, of course, even global dimension. But we acted locally, but you know, many of the issues that we wanted to set on the agenda are basically not just local issues. And in that sense, this is in such a political context, it's both, you know, municipalist philosophy as our type of philosophy and political strategy for creating this counterpower is on one hand, something new. We offer some type of new political imaginations to citizens, something different from you know, traditional mainstream political parties organized in a hierarchical way as the state is. But at the same time, this is a risk because when you have such a strong party state, basically, citizens who want to oppose this, they basically want confrontation. They want one bloc that will confront this. And it's very difficult to be in that unless you are able to create such a counterpower. We are not there yet, especially starting as a local movement. You know, the risks and basically messages of many of citizens were that you know, they've seen us as some alternative, but they were not sure that we can be alternative that they can win, that will win. and it's imperative that you win, and not just one city, but the entire state. Now, there is important thing about particularly winning this city, because there will be next year elections for Belgrade. Belgrade is the capital of Serbia. It's really huge city. It is also where the political prospects of the ruling party are the weakest. So it's like some kind of a weak spot that strategically it's important to win. And in that sense, if Belgrade is won on one hand or the another, we will definitely have this situation of a city against the state, because even in the previous period, when there were some mayors, oppositional public would call them mayors of free towns, which did not necessarily have municipalist agenda, but were some of them had have been more in touch with citizens than others. Not of course not municipalist agenda. All the resources were basically used to fight these so-called mayors of free towns. So basically, this is the situation we are in. And as I said, this basically intermediation between local and national, and it's and state level, is particularly important also in a narrative, because Serbia is a country with not really defined borders. It was once part of Yugoslavia that was torn or dissoluted, or whatever term you want to use. Basically, the issue of state building is really important. So tackling the state it's kind of a attacking very sensitive spots for many citizens. So I think in terms of also of a narrative, attacking state as such is not really viable political strategy, but attacking party state, because basically, especially after the COVID crisis, we have almost equality between party and the state, because the crisis allowed basically party members to take over the positions of the state and help citizens, and basically took over all of the authorities from local municipalities in order to prove that they are those caring for citizens, protecting citizens, and the like. And we as ordinary citizens were practically not allowed to do. I mean, we had to basically only jump into places where were completely uncovered by state, like homeless people or informal settlements of Roma people, these type of things that or citizens could organize and jump in and show some solidarity. But basically the legislation was so crude that it was even difficult to show, these neighborhood activism, especially in terms of pandemics. So the conditions are very, very difficult, and this sets the situation where you can't really, you basically you have to lower your municipalist ambitions. You have to think whether this entire philosophy can allow you to fight the fear that is really dominant in the city and in the country, and use different type of activities for different type of mobilization. So fighting the fear in this situation of very centralized state that is run by a political party that I like to say is on one hand a corporation of political and economic elite, and on the other hand national employment agency for destitute citizens who are basically corrupted into giving their consent if they vote or do various things for the party. Then they will get a job in either not necessarily just the public sector, but also in private sector, because private and public are very much connected. Fighting such a basically Leviathan, requires that you develop a strategy to, in a way, allow for people to release their fear and gain some strength into just entering this struggle. Even that is very difficult. We participated in the elections in 2018, Belgrade city elections, and some say that these were the elections that really changed this, position of a state from some kind of unconsolidated democracy into a hybrid regime. So we've seen what it is like. And basically, political repression does not happen just on the election day. It happens throughout the year, because ruling party is basically constantly in the electoral campaign. Just the fact to be a political movement with the ambition of winning, of basically opposing various detrimental projects and maybe running for some elections is a risk. So on one hand, usually what happens is that candidates are vilified by both public and private media, because public media controlled by the party state, and private media have their own deals. They basically extract benefits from the party in exchange for abusing national frequencies. So, either you are faced this position of a villain, which is usually much more easier, to do with the traditional oppositional parties who used to be in the government in some previous cycles. And that's kind of an opportunity for municipalist platform, because it's much more difficult to vilify ordinary citizens and municipalist activists like that. But on the other hand, it's difficult for public to get to know them. So, you have to devise different strategies, just being recognized and by various publics. The other thing that usually happens is this co-optation of candidates, of parties. For example, Belgrade has 17 municipalities, as a city, and up until a couple of years ago, there were several of them run by mayors of these municipalities within the city of Belgrade. They were not part of the ruling party. After last year, there was only one, and this mayor and his entire party just merged, a couple of weeks ago with the ruling party. So co-optation is pretty much one strategy that's very much used. And it's also something that we can also see in the ways the state and authorities basically all over are dealing with mushrooming civic initiatives, movements, local neighborhoods, fighting against various different detrimental projects in their neighborhoods. Basically, I would say that the fact that these initiatives are mushrooming is in a way our success, because we started first. We were some kind of an incubator for. We showed the way, and we are supporting all of them. But the danger is always that many of them, the authorities will pick and choose some of them and give them what they want in order to disallow any potential for coordination, cooperation, and confluence basically of this dissatisfaction of citizens. This is what we're trying to do now. We learned in the past couple of years that we need to, in a way, reconcile our municipalist philosophy with to adapt to the situation that we are in. But we need to create and think about municipalist organization. So, we don't want to create a new traditional party, but we need to think, and that's the main focus that we have been doing in last 2 years, 3 already, building a different type of organization, that will be participatory structure, but that will be in a way effective and, maintain this imagination of citizens, allow different type of activities for those who are really afraid to be part of something that's not so confrontational, that is something that they feel that, will help them share a vision of good city with others, just maybe seeing that there are other peoples like them with similar problems. But on the other hand, there is a need for confrontational activities as well, because you need to show that you will not be co-opted, that you are a legitimate opposition. So this creates a situation where we as a municipalist movement are attacked not just by state and authorities, but also by traditional parties, because they see us as some kind of competition. And so we are always in between, where and on one hand we have to think about how we want to maintain what basically kept us together, what formed us, but also that we do not, we have to also understand that citizens expect some wider struggle against the party state. So it's not just enough that we say it's important to maintain that, what we have been saying all along, that it's important to change how politics is done and how citizen needs are the first on the agenda. But at the same time, we need to think how to convince people that by doing this, we can also win. So that is basically this situation we have. I have to say that it's very bleak, but on the other hand, we do have some examples in the neighborhood. Our partnership organization, Zagreb Naš just won elections in Zagreb. So this is type of a political strategy that we also have. We also have, as a local movement, cooperation with similar local movements from other cities and towns in Serbia. So basically, that's our way of thinking about confederation of free cities. But unfortunately, none of these have power yet. And I have to say that, even you can create some kind of counterpower within civil society, but with such strong attack of the state, that is not enough. And you can't really create autonomous zone, because we are not in a position of a free space. So it's necessary. I think, and it's the only way you will be seen as credible, to basically confront and say we can create alternative institutions while we work on creating this counterpower. But we constantly also need to show that we want to reclaim these state institutions, so that they're not just party state institution, but that they become citizen institution again. So this dual strategy, I think, is necessary, and it's very difficult, because it requires a lot of skills and people to do all of these things in situations of great risks, and basically oftentimes not just risks of losing their jobs, but also losing their good name, or even losing their life. But it is what it is, and we are here to stay. So that there is no other options but trying to do this and develop something on the ground, adapt to the needs that we have, learning from other experiences. But unfortunately, we can't have bigger ambition than that at this stage. Thank you.
Biljana, thank you so much. That's really inspiring. Your story about it's just the work that you're doing under the conditions that you're doing is really inspiring, and really sort of gives I think a feeling that if you can do it there, surely in many municipalities all over the world, people can struggle in the same way. And I really appreciate that. It'd be great to talk some more. I want to just mention that we just have a few minutes left. I know that Pablo basically has to leave. Pablo, do you have any last remarks that you'd like to make before you go, or it's time to say goodbye? That's fine.
Apologize to everybody, because I have to leave to meet a family obligation, but it's been wonderful to hear from my fellow panelists and learn from them. I'm just typing in the chat. I will leave my email in case anybody wants to pursue the conversation. And thank you again. I'm really sorry I have to leave, and good luck, everybody, especially Biljana. I know so much of what you were saying resonates so deeply in my experience. So good luck, and keep up the good fight. Thank you very much. Thank you, Debbie. Have a wonderful discussion. And I'm really sorry I have to go. Bye-bye.
Thank you for being here with us. I do want to just say that there's been a couple of questions that have come in from one person in particular. And I'm just gonna put them out there. I'm just gonna read all three of his questions and see if anybody wants to respond. I'm gonna go from the bottom up. The first part is sort of how much time should citizens spend so that a communalist or municipalist society works? I think some of these might be directed towards you, 16. What would be the place of the most excluded and poorest people in the process? And what's the place of non-human species in this perspective? So would you like to take a minute to address some of those, 16?
Sure, some of it are very big questions, so I'll try to be as short as possible.
Right.
About the time that the citizens should spend so that community society would work, well, the thing is, it's actually linked with the second. The thing is that communalism does entail a complete rearrangement of how the economy works. And so what Bookchin would call for was the municipalization of the economy. So basically that was the subordination of the economy to the popular assembly, so that the popular assembly would take the decision economically, so the decision concerning the production, the distribution, the consumption, and so on and so forth. So all the economy would basically be rearranged, and so would the work. And so the time freed, also the work that would no longer, have to be carried out, and maybe on that purpose you can read a bullshit job of David Graeber, because there are many works that are not necessary for a community to work. They're necessary maybe for capitalism to work, but not for the survival of a community, even in confederal model. And so that time freed up would be for meetings. And I mean, we can imagine just one meeting per week can be a good start. And if you think about it, it's not such a big commitment. I mean, it's a big commitment now, but if you take the measure so that people who are excluded because of transport, so that women can attend, so that they don't have their childcare to bear at that moment, there can be many things that can help people to attend. And so the place of the most excluded and poorest, well, basically again, it rests, I mean, as I see it, it rests on the collectivization of property. So in that sense, it would reach such a level of equality that, I mean, everybody would participate in, and to me, there wouldn't be any poor in the end in a community society. In the transition now, it's a different game, because of course we are not in a society that is equal. So there could definitely be assemblies of people, or more voice given to poorest people, and also voice given to the workers in the place where they work, in their workplace, to decide more on the way that the work operate, on their conditions of work, etc. So that would be a point. And for most excluded people, for example, because of racism or stuff like that, there could be caucuses or assemblies where they can deliberate their own interests before coming to the assembly, so that they would have a chance to first deliberate their interests and not be confronted as like supposedly equal but not really equal because of the hierarchical relationship that spans the society. And the place of non-human species, well, it's part of social ecology, which is bigger, broader perspective that sees hierarchy as the main issue, and that would see that the idea of domination over nature stems from the idea of domination of human over humans. So basically, if we change that mindset of domination among humans, there would be less or no domination on nature. But on the specific place of, like, I don't know, parliament for nature or something like that, I mean, communalism doesn't really tackle that thing. It could be interesting definitely to go more in that, but I don't have any answer from communalist theory on that purpose. But maybe Jonathan has something to say more on those three questions.
Yeah, I think that you answered really well because it's a big, pretty like three big questions. For the first one, I would say in a communalist society, people would work more and participate more, not only in popular assemblies, but in different spheres of life, of social life. There will be much like more free time to express several types of activities, cultural, artistic, political activities. And at the same time, we would need actually to manage spheres of democracy that would be efficient at the same time, because a word that Oscar Wilde said before, with the problem with socialism is that it takes too many evenings. And I think it would be the same thing for communist society, because we'll have to chat, to deliberate, to take decisions together at several scales at the same time, in the economic sphere, the political sphere, cultural sphere, and everywhere. So we have we would not be able to participate every time on every decision. There would be a kind of delegation of power at the same time, but we need, I think, some kind of imperative mandates, and not representative mandates that would sign a kind of a check or decision that say, oh, you take care of this and I don't take care of anything. We have to be, and we have to educate ourselves, like trying to learn how to become more active citizens in the broad way. It's not only having some papers, being a citizen of the state, but being an active participant in our social life. So that would be my answer for this. And for the other parts, a communalist society would be inclusive of every people concerned by the decisions. And even if we have a broad view of what it would mean, we would have to take into account the interests of non-human species and animals and ecosystems. But at the same time, having a practical way to do it, we'll need to feed ourselves, and how do we try to manage to reduce suffering and at the same time live a good life. So I think there will be some trade-off, and we'll have to manage it in a democratic and just way. So that's a broad answer, and it would take another hour, I think, to discuss about this.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. We have just really 2 minutes left. I would like to just 2 minutes say, but I would really just, Juliana, can I ask you just quickly, when, in terms of Don't Let Belgrade Down, is there any relationship with, either sister organizations or within the group that has thought about running candidates also for higher office, or or enlisting, I don't know, the social movements in some way to help sort of alleviate some of the threat or even the fear that comes with running for office? Those are sort of two questions, but we have like 2 minutes, but if you could.
Yeah, well, I mean, even last time, and we plan, if we go into elections next year, to do it this time as well. It's a broader platform, not just of members of Don't Let Belgrade Down, but also trying to have other movements. Unfortunately, we don't really have so many movements, it's also, it's emerging, both in Serbia and in the region, the various movements are emerging, but it's difficult to say if all of these are really social movements. Some of these are local initiatives that are smaller, but, have potential of connecting. We are at this stage, a situation where only now we have a potentially ecological movement. We have many ecological activists, but they're not movement yet. So this is all boiling at the moment, and it's difficult to have them all together. But this is the intention. And the second thing is the problem is often that elections are put on the same day, so presidential, parliamentary, and especially that will be the strategy to fight potential weakness of the Belgrade city elections. We hope that this will not happen, and then in this situation, strategically, it's really bad if you don't try to go in a national platform as well. But of course, we can't do it as a local movement. That will require, again, some type of trying to have a bigger coalition. We do have this organization of local civic initiatives that's called Civic Front, that we are part of. This is a strategic plan that type of a confederation. It's very loose confederation. So these are some ideas about the future. To put it quickly, in the last minute.
And sorry, yeah, no, we were out of time, but thank you so much for that presentation. Thank you, 16, also for the beautiful elaboration of communalism. Thank you, Jonathan, for laying out some of these issues. It's obviously a conversation that has to continue, and it's something that we will continue. So thank you very, very much, all of you, and to Pablo, who had to go. And thanks for everybody who tuned in. It's going to be obviously another tremendous 4 days of conferences, of panels, of discussion, and I know I'm excited about it, and I look forward to it, and hope everybody else will stay tuned as well. Take care and have a good evening or afternoon wherever you are.